In the last hours before shift change, when the forged son of Viheros hung low behind a curtain of ash, the front line should have been loud. It should have been the usual music of an Imperium at war, the cough of lasfire, the grinding tread of tanks, the constant prayers rasped into vox beads by men who had learned to ask for mercy only after the barrel cooled. Instead, there was a hush that did not belong to any battle doctrine. It spread along the trenches, as if the air itself had chosen to hold its breath. Before we descend into the chaos of this tale, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more legends and dark histories from the Warhammer 40k universe. The first squad to notice it moved forward cautiously, boots sinking into churned mud that had long ago forgotten the color of water. The soldiers expected carnage. A corn raid had hit this sector at dawn, and the ground still wore the black scorch of chain-blade work, the kind that left nothing gentle behind. Yet the trench ahead was empty in the wrong way. Not the clean emptiness of retreat, not the scattered emptiness of rout, but a vacancy so complete it felt curated. Rifles lay where hands had dropped them, helmets sat upright on the firing step, and a dozen sets of flak armor rested against the parapet like shed skins. No bodies, no blood, no dragged trails leading down into craters, only frost. Thin white crystals clung to bayonets and buckles, crawling over metal with patient certainty. They did not melt in the heat of the forge world. They did not steam under reactor glow. They simply held as if the temperature obeyed a rule older than the planet. The air carried a faint iron sweetness, the ghost of a funeral pyre that had burned elsewhere. A sergeant knelt, pressed gloved fingers to the frozen rim of a canteen, and felt a cold that did not come from weather, a cold that came from absence. A soft tremor went through the line behind him, not fear yet, but something close to recognition. These soldiers knew demons, they knew Xenos. They knew the way chaos killed, loud and hungry, the way orcs killed, careless and delighted, the way tyranids killed, clean and tidal. This was none of those. There were no claw marks on the walls, no burned pits, no spent shells, no spoor of warp fury hanging like ozone in the throat. Whatever had passed through here had not fought, it had taken. As the squad advanced, the silence deepened. Vox sets crackled to life and died again, skipping as if a hand pressed down on the signal. Auspex readings returned nothing but static and a strange rhythmic void, a pulse that felt less like interference and more like a heartbeat that did not belong to any living thing. The trench line itself seemed to bow, timber supports creaking under a weight that could not be seen, earth settling as though someone tall and inevitable had walked through, and the world had decided to remember the footprint. Farther in, the frost thickened. It glazed over dog tags, over prayer scrolls, over a small charm of the Aquila that had been kissed 1,000 times. Each object looked untouched, yet each one felt newly orphaned. In the stillness, even the lasguns seemed to wait for permission to exist. Somewhere deep beneath the hive, behind layers of rust and scripture, a presence stirred in the dark. Awareness gathered slowly, the way winter gathers at the edge of a candle flame. It did not need to ask where it was. The air spoke in funerals, the planet spoke in slaughter, and the galaxy beyond spoke in an endless tide of dying that had gone unclaimed for too long. The thought rose with calm certainty, not a question but a verdict. This realm bleeds without a true queen of death. The words came steady and low inside a mind that had ruled Hel and Niflheim, and now tasted a wider, harsher afterlife waiting to be mastered. On the surface, the soldiers felt none of that name, none of that history, only the tightening pressure of something entering their world that was not prey and not predator in any way they understood. The trench remained empty, the frost remained bright, and the war around them seemed to dim, as if reality itself had shifted to make room. Ahead lay a silence that promised meaning, and behind it, a figure was already rising to claim what this universe had always wasted. Viheros was never a world meant for beauty. It had been built to endure, and then rebuilt to suffer, layer upon layer of iron devotion stamped into its crust. From orbit it looked like a rusted cog drowned in soot, its continents broken by manufactorum sprawls and hive towers that rose like blackened teeth through a sky the color of old blood. The sun above was weak behind the ash veil, a pale ember that never fully reached the ground, leaving the planet lit by the glare of forges and the tired glow of shrine fires. The hive forge of Dominus V. Harrows covered the horizon for 1,000 kilometers in every direction. Its lower levels were a maze of pipes, cooling ducts, rail arteries, and service cathedrals where machinery and worship had merged into a single rhythm. The middle tiers swelled with hab blocks packed so tightly that the air itself had learned to queue, carrying sweat, incense, oil smoke, and the sour tang of recycled breath. Above it all, in the upper hive spires, gilded bridges connected governor halls to ecclesiarchal chapels and mechanicus sanctums, places where the walls still remembered white stone and the floors were not always sticky with industrial runoff. Life here was not measured by years. It was measured by shifts, by rations, by how many times the warning sirens wailed before a shift ended. Every citizen knew the catechisms of survival before they knew their own names. Faith came in the same bundles as water filters and starch bricks, issued early and repeated often, because fear without ritual turns to panic, and panic turns to rebellion. The streets were lined with icons worn smooth by hands that could not afford doubt. Servo skulls drifted through the smog, reciting hymns and scanning for heresy with lenses that never blinked. Priests walked beside tech adepts, both speaking different dialects of the same promise, that suffering served a purpose, that death was a doorway to something larger than the body could carry. War had always lived on V. Harrows, but in recent years it had become a permanent weather. The planet's exports of shells, armor plating, and reactor components made it a prize in a sector where chaos raids cut supply lines like arteries. The Iron Warriors had tried to crack the hive last decade, leaving scars that never stopped smoking. Corn cults spread in the underhive like mildew in a drowned room, feeding on despair and the simple truth that rage comes easier than hope. Every few weeks the skies bled fire as drop pods fell, and the ground answered with artillery until the air turned thick enough to chew. The defense lines shifted, but the factories never stopped because the Imperium could tolerate many losses, but never a pause in production. Death was not a stranger here. It was part of the payroll. In the lower manufactorums, workers died with conveyor belts still moving overhead. In the trenches outside the city, guardsmen died in rows that had barely learned their names. In the medici wards, the dying were stacked so tightly that the chaplains had to bless them in batches. Bodies were burned or recycled, bones ground into nutrient paste, ashes pressed into bricks for new hab walls. Grief was private and quick because the next siren always came, and there was no time to hold the dead longer than a prayer. Yet faith held the world together in ways steel never could. It lived in the quiet bows to passing shrines, in the murmured litanies said before firing a lasgun, in the way a mother traced the aquila on her child's brow even while the ceiling shook from bombardment. It was the myth that made 1,000,000 exhausted lives feel aligned with an emperor so distant he had become more idea than man. The people of V. Harrows did not ask whether the Imperium loved them. They asked only whether their suffering still mattered to something greater. That was the stage the galaxy had prepared without knowing it, a planet of iron lungs and constant funerals, built on prayer to withstand horrors that came from the warp and the stars. A world already cracking under the weight of endless war, held together by ritual and necessity, where even the air tasted of rust and devotion. And deep beneath all that, in sealed stone and forgotten shadow, another kind of authority had begun to wake, drawn toward a realm where death was everywhere, and no one truly ruled it yet. The silence at the trenches did not stay on the battlefield. It rode the supply trains back into Hive Dominus, crept along the maintenance shafts, and settled into the lowest levels where the hive's heart beat thickest. The underhive of V. Harrows was a place the upper tiers pretended did not exist, a tangled ocean of rusted walkways and forgotten chambers, lit by dying lumen strips and the orange pulse of distant furnaces. Down here, the air carried more metal than oxygen. Every breath tasted like pennies and old smoke. Every step echoed into corridors that had not seen a sanctioned inspection in centuries. Rumors began like they always did, soft at first, exchanged between workers who were too tired to lie for entertainment. A porter swore that a whole habro had gone quiet overnight, doors hanging open, tables half set, bowls still warm. No blood on the floor, no signs of struggle, no hymn scrolls torn in a frenzy, only emptiness that felt arranged. A salvager stumbled into a drinking den with frost on his lashes and said he had seen a procession moving through the sump market, men and women walking without sound, pale as parchment, eyes empty of hunger. They followed a tall figure cloaked in green-black armor, a queen-shaped shadow cutting through crowds that could not decide whether to flee or kneel. The story spread because it fit the Underhive's logic. A place where people vanished every day did not need much evidence for a new kind of vanishing. Still, there was something different in these whispers. The missing were not taken for ransom, not dragged into cult dens, not harvested by gang surgeons. Their rooms had been left unscavenged, their tools untouched. Even in a hive where theft was a second religion, the remaining possessions carried a cold that made hands pull back. The frost people spoke of was not from leaking coolant lines or broken insulation. It came with the rumor itself, as if the tale carried its own winter. Gangs reacted before the Adeptus Arbites could bother to look down this far. The Iron Nails, who controlled the sump rail routes, sent scouts into the black to confirm or kill the story. Those scouts never returned, and their territory began to shrink without a shot fired. A rival crew found one of the missing scouts later, standing upright in a maintenance alcove, armor locked on, lasgun cradled politely across his chest. The visor was empty. The man inside was empty. Yet the body did not sag or rot, and the helmet's inner vox beads still hummed faintly, repeating a single string of static that sounded like distant breathing. Fear in the Underhive rarely stays fear. It curdles into worship or violence, depending on who finds it first. Since no one understood the pattern, both appeared at once. Shrines to the Emperor gained extra candles in some corners, prayers muttered faster, more desperate, as if speed could substitute for certainty. In other corridors, hastily painted skull icons appeared, a warning that some new patron had claimed the routes. Workers stopped traveling alone. Gangers began marking their wrists with crude wards against death, not against chaos, but against the kind of taking that left no corpse to bargain for. Above them, the hive continued its usual roar, ignorant of the slow tide rolling beneath it. Conveyor lines kept swallowing ore and exhaling munitions. Tech priests chanted binaric litanies over engines that ran too hot. The ecclesiarchy preached endurance from altars polished by generations of trembling hands. Yet even in the middle tiers, subtle symptoms surfaced. A medici attendant swore the morgue was lighter than its intake count. A Vox operator reported faint cold spots drifting through signal traffic, minor disruptions that did not match known warp interference. Servitors paused for half a second at random corridor junctions, as if recognizing something passing through their peripheral awareness. The mystery was not a scream, it was a tide. It rose in corners no one watched, gathered adherents without asking, and rewrote the Underhive's rules in quiet steps. Somewhere deeper still, beyond sealed blast doors and strata older than the Imperium's records, something moved with deliberate patience. It did not announce itself. It did not need to. The Underhive already knew the taste of death, and now it was learning the taste of death with direction. The hive felt the difference before it understood it, and that unspoken recognition began to spread upward like a slow breath, carrying the story toward a face no one had named yet. Below the sump canals and the gang-choked warrens, V-Harrows hid wounds that predated its current wars. Forgotten construction levels sank into the planet like scar tissue. superstructures collapsed and rebuilt over so many millennia that the maps became prayers rather than measurements. In those depths, the hive pressed against bedrock where ancient hands had carved something that was not a factory and not a shrine, but a vault built to keep an idea asleep. The Mechanicus had sealed it long ago, not out of piety, but out of fear of what the data suggested. The ecclesiarchy had stamped it heretical without ever reading the stones. Time did the rest, dust and pressure turning the place into myth. Inside that vault, the air was dry and still, unmoving in the way tomb air refuses to participate in the living world. Walls of black ferrostone were engraved with warding circles and sigmoid runes, older imperial script layered over even older markings that did not belong to any human tongue. The place had once held a conclave of psychers, a failed experiment to bind death itself into something controllable, a desperate move from a forgotten age when the Imperium still believed it could master every force by naming it. Whatever they had tried, they had succeeded only in making a lock. The key had been lost, and the lock remained waiting. Hela opened eyes to that stillness, not summoned by chanting cultists, not hurled from some dramatic sky breach, but awake already inside the sealed dark as if sleep had simply ended. The first sensation was insult, a cold fury rising without needing fuel. The second was clarity. A presence like this did not stumble into confusion for long. Awareness spread outward, not as a probing question, but as a sovereign claim. Reality answered with weight, with iron, with the smell of 1 billion deaths stacked into the planet's bones. The vault's wards shivered at the intrusion of her consciousness, runes flaring with tired light, trying to define what stood within their circle. It was a definition they were not built to hold. Asgardian godhood did not map neatly to warp taxonomy. The sigils strained, then cracked, not in explosion but in surrender, their power exhausted by centuries of waiting, and a target they could not truly bind. The floor groaned as if relieved to let something stand again. Dust lifted in a slow ring around armored feet that had never asked permission to tread. The goddess rose in full silence, green-black armor, catching the faint ember light of long-dead lumens. Hair fell like midnight water down the backplate. The helm was absent, but the face carried a sharper armor than any ceramite, a beauty so severe it bordered on judgment. The blades did not appear yet. They did not need to. A queen does not draw steel when the room is already hers. Memory returned in fragments, not gentle but precise. Hel, Niflheim, the halls of the dead under her rule, souls filed into order like frost into a riverbed. The taste of betrayal, the hunger for dominion, the way conquest had once been the only language others understood. Then a gap, a severing in sleep that had ended here, in a world that was not her own. Yet the longer she listened to the air, the more the insult shifted into something else, a grim satisfaction forming at the edge of thought. This galaxy was a mausoleum that had forgotten who owned the keys. Death here was constant, casual, wasted, thrown into the warp like chaff to be devoured by things that did not deserve it. The Emperor's servants fed their dead into a throne. The ruinous powers harvested souls by appetite. Everywhere the dead were currency for others, and nowhere did they have a sovereign. The realization was not a plan, it was recognition, simple as winter knowing where to fall. She moved toward the vault's gate, not hurried. Each step carried a pressure that made the old stones creak. The sealed door was a slab thick enough to stop blast shells, edged with rusted hydraulics and purity seals turned brittle with age. Her palm pressed to it lightly. Strength flowed through muscle and will without strain. Metal complained, then yielded. Bolts sheared. The door slid open with a scream that died quickly beneath her calm, leaving a corridor beyond lined with service pipes and black shadow. The underhive waited on the other side like a throat waiting to speak. Hela walked into it, and the darkness did not resist. It rearranged itself around her silhouette. Somewhere above, men whispered about a pale procession and frost in the sump markets. They did not know the name yet, but the world was beginning to shape itself around the presence of a ruler who had awakened already inside its bones, and who now had a realm of endless war to inherit. The underhive did not greet her. It simply endured her presence the way stone endures a glacier. The corridors were narrow, built for service servitors and maintenance crews long dead, but her passage widened them in a subtler way. Pipes vibrated as if remembering older winters. Pools of chemical runoff filmed over in thin ice, not because she willed it directly, but because her nature carried a climate of its own. Death has a temperature, and where she walked, that temperature followed. She did not need to ask what this place was. The air was saturated with endings. Even in silence, the hive spoke in mortality, a background chorus of exhausted hearts and breaking bodies. Every direction held a thread leading to another funeral. It was not like Asgard, where death came in seasons and had a defined border. Here death was industrial, continuous, processed into numbers by clerks who never saw the faces. It was so abundant that the living had stopped regarding it as sacred. The recognition stirred something like contempt, then settled into cold purpose. Hela's dominion over the dead had never been a trick of ritual. It was authority written into her being. Souls that passed into her realm did so because the realm answered to her, because the dead understood hierarchy even when the living pretended otherwise. In this galaxy, the dead did not naturally flow to hell. They spilled into the warp, into the hungry ocean where chaos gods fished for them, or into the emperor's tithe through sanctioned sacrifice. Yet the core truth remained: death is not owned by those who feed on it. It is owned by the one who rules it. The moment her senses brushed the warp's undertow of souls, her power did not change shape. It found a new river to command. There were no new abilities blooming from the soil. Instead, her known power stretched to the scale of what surrounded her. The dead of Viharros were everywhere, layered in strata beneath the hive, blown into ash across the trenches, stacked in medici pits, dissolved into recycling vats. She felt them like a continent feels its buried bones. She felt how their souls were pressured upward into Immaterium currents they never chose. That flow had been unchallenged for 10,000 years. Now it met something that did not bargain. Her step carried through a junction where a ceiling had collapsed, creating a mound of refuse and half-buried skeletons from a forgotten riot. The bones were old, stripped by time and vermin, but the imprint of their deaths remained. Fingers clenched in terror, ribs cracked by blunt instruments, a final prayer scratched into stone by a nail that had torn the hand it belonged to. Hela's gaze rested on them without pity. Pity was not her language, order was. A silent pull of will extended, and the bones stirred, not in dramatic flair, but in the way iron filings stir toward a magnet. Bodies assembled themselves from debris, joints ratcheting quietly as if remembering their original alignment. The dead stood because she allowed it, because their state was hers to define. She listened further, and the galaxy answered with violence. Above, artillery thundered. Beneath, gangers sharpened knives. Somewhere in the hive, a fanatic whispered to a skull altar. Each act of murder, each dying breath sent a ripple across her awareness. The warp was loud with those ripples, translating death into a food source for gods of appetite. But her presence introduced a different rule, a claim that did not come from hunger, but from inheritance. If the warp was a storm, she was the winter that freezes its surface. When a soul slipped free nearby, a worker crushed under a failed lift, it would usually flare into Immaterium like a spark into wind. This time it hesitated. The spark wavered, tasted her gravity, and fell inward, not because she stole it by force, but because her realm offered structure in a place that had become chaos. The soul belonged to death, death belonged to her. The chain was simple. In that early hour, she was not yet making war. She was learning the ecosystem she had entered, measuring how much of it already lived under her default sovereignty. 1,000,000 deaths every day, and none of them claimed properly. The thought was steady, unadorned, a verdict that shaped itself into intent. This galaxy had forgotten its queen. It would remember her, not by spectacle, but by the quiet, irresistible rearrangement of what dies and where it goes. With that calm certainty settling in her chest like a crown, she moved onward, and the underhive's darkness followed in obedient silence, ready to become a kingdom. The first living eyes to truly meet her were not imperial officers or priests, but underhive gangers who survived by pretending fear was a weakness. The sump market of Cobalt Row lay like an infected vein beneath the hive, a corridor turned bazaar where scavenged machine parts were traded beside illegal amasic and the occasional human tooth of uncertain origin. Neon icons flickered above stalls built from scrap plating, and the crowd moved with a predator's caution. Violence there was routine, attacks paid in fists and blades whenever someone felt bold enough to demand it. Her arrival did not announce itself. No thunder, no flood of war plight, only a shift in temperature that made breath smoke in front of mouths that had forgotten cold. Conversations thinned to murmurs. A servo-skull vendor felt his augmetic stutter and watched frost creep across his tray of cogitator chips. People stepped aside without knowing why, forming a wide lane as a tall woman walked through the market with the patience of someone who owns time. Armor plates caught the sickly lumen glow, green-black edges dull as grave metal, and each footfall landed with a weight that suggested inevitability rather than threat. The iron nails had a toll station at the far end, a barricade of welded doors and scavenged gun shields. They did not tolerate unknowns crossing their territory without payment, and they liked even less the way the crowd's fear seemed to rearrange itself around this stranger. A half-dozen gangers stepped forward, masks painted red, chain blades whining low in eager hands. Their leader was a thick-set brute called Joran, more scar tissue than skin, whose pride had survived every war because nothing had ever challenged it directly. The demand came rough and loud, a ritual of authority, payment, name, purpose. The words were spat out more for the watching crowd than for her, a reminder that the underhive still belonged to men who bled for it. Hela looked at them as one looks at insects near a throne, not with surprise, not with anger yet, only with an assessment that stripped their posturing down to the issue of usefulness. Violence started when Joran lunged, too impatient to wait for fear to do its work. The chain blade surged toward her throat in a red-toothed arc, her hand lifted barely an inch. From the air itself, a necro blade formed, black and elegant, its edge shaped like a shard of night. It met the chain blade with a sound that was not clash but dismissal, and the ganger's weapon came apart in smoking halves. Before his mind caught up, another blade flowered from her other hand and entered his chest as if the armor did not exist. No flourish followed. The body simply dropped. His men hesitated for a breath. That breath was all a queen of death needed. A storm of blades unfolded around her, each one an extension of the same dominion. The gangers died quickly, not because they were weak, but because they were irrelevant. Blood hit the frost-slick ground in dark beads, steaming faintly before freezing into a crust. The crowd did not scream. It watched. Then the fallen rose again. Not in grotesque convulsions, not in a parody of life, but straightening with the quiet obedience of tools returning to their racks. Eyes were glassy, mouths slack, yet the bodies moved with steady coordination. Wounds remained because she did not heal death into life. She commanded death in its own form. Joran's corpse lifted its shattered chain blade and knelt at her feet. The others joined him in a soundless half-circle, awaiting a will that now owned them. The market froze more deeply than the floor. Some people backed away, palms making warding signs. Others dropped to their knees for different reasons, a reflex older than theology, the instinct to recognize a sovereign when one stands unchallenged. A few brave or foolish souls tried to whisper prayers to the emperor, but the words died in throats gone dry. Hela turned toward the lane ahead, and her new dead followed in lockstep. The underhive had seen tyrants and monsters before. It had seen chaos cult leaders whip the desperate into frenzy. It had seen Arbite's raids where bodies stacked into gutters. This was something else, a power that did not seek followers through promises. It simply converted them through death and then walked onward with them like a growing shadow. As she left the market behind, the crowd remained split between awe and terror, both emotions feeding the same quiet rumor. The pale woman did not just kill, she collected. The dead did not vanish, they returned to her. The Underhive understood one rule above all others: power is real when it rewrites the streets. With that rule settling into their bones, the story of her passage began climbing toward the hive's higher lungs, carried by mouths that had learned to fear winter more than fire. News travels in a hive the way heat travels through metal, fast along the right channels, slow everywhere else, but impossible to stop. The rumor from Cobalt Row bled outward in widening circles, passed from sump traders to shift workers, from shift workers to Medici attendants, from attendants to priests who pretended to listen only to confessions. Each retelling changed details, but the core remained sharp: a woman in armor walking without haste, frost following her steps, dead men rising behind her with their weapons lowered in service. The hive did not know her name. It felt her anyway. In the lower manufactorums, the first response was practical fear. Supervisors ordered work crews to stay within lit corridors. Maintenance drones were kept close. A few crews sealed hatchways leading deeper down, muttering litanies over the bolts as if holy words could replace missing welds. Yet even while they tried to lock her out, something in the air shifted. Furnace heat took longer to bite. Condensation formed on pipe walls in patterns that resembled breath. Servitors paused at workstations for a fraction too long, heads tilting as their auger arrays registered a cold they could not catalog. In the Medici wards, the change carried a different implication. The morgue counters stopped matching the casualty intake. Bodies that should have been arriving did not. It was not that the wounded lived. The wounded still died by the hundreds, but the dead were lighter, emptied in a way that left medical staff unsettled. A chirurgeon lifted a corpse's eyelid and felt the absence beneath it, a hollow that did not belong to anesthesia or shock. Chaplains noticed it too. Their rites met less resistance in the air, as if some of the dead were no longer listening to the emperor's promise, but belonging elsewhere already. For the ecclesiarchy, the first instinct was denial, then doctrine. Priests in the middle tiers preached harder on the sanctity of proper death, warning that any corpse that walked again was a doorway for the warp. Candles doubled on altars. Processions gained more skull icons, more incense, more frantic devotion. Yet the people listening were not only afraid. Among the exhausted, among those who had buried children without time to cry, there was another emotion rising, thin but stubborn. What if someone finally rules the dead properly? The thought was heresy, and it spread anyway. The Mechanicus reacted in its own language. Tech priests monitoring atmospheric and noospheric data noted irregular soul load patterns in the warp bleed, fluctuations that did not match demon incursion signatures. Auspex arrays registered cold zones moving upward through the hive's substructure, not tied to coolant failures or reactor anomalies. Machine spirits became restless. Some shrine engines refused startup rights, others powered on too easily, as if appeased by a silence that suited their old, half-forgotten instincts. Amagos logged the event as an unknown metaphysical interference, and then deleted the record before a higher authority could demand a classification he did not have. The Astra Militarum garrison felt it next through morale. Patrols returning from lower levels reported a pressure in the chest that made even veterans glance back over shoulders. Vox operators complained of gaps in transmissions that felt less like static and more like a listening presence. A squad commander swore that during a routine sweep, a corpse in a corner had turned its head toward the patrol, not hostile, only attentive, like a soldier awaiting orders from someone the patrol could not see. Reports stacked on Colonel Roth's desk in neat rows of unease. Through all of it, the hive's rhythm did not stop. Forges still burned, guns still fired, people still died. Yet the deaths no longer felt entirely swallowed by the same old void. The atmosphere itself began to carry a mild gravity, a quiet sense that an authority had entered the city that did not ask permission from imperial seals or chaos rites. It was not a terror that screamed. It was a certainty that cooled. Deep below, Hela moved through tunnels that widened into service chapels and forgotten transit ways. Each step tugged another thread of attention upward. She did not need to announce her arrival to the hive's ruling structures. Their fear was already announcing her for her. The city was beginning to feel what a true queen of death feels like, not as a sudden apocalypse, but as a slow, unavoidable rearrangement of where endings belong. The awareness spread through V-harrows like frost through cracked pavement, and with it came a soft, inevitable handoff toward the moment when the Imperium would finally look down and realize something had risen inside its own bones. The underhive did not stay quiet for long once the dead began to march. In the deepest strata of Dominus V-harrows, where the air tasted of sump gas and old sins, there were always those who listened for power the way starving dogs listen for bones. Khorne cults had grown fat in these levels over decades of war, feeding on the planet's endless violence, carving their symbols into boiler rooms and drainage chapels, turning every riot and gang war into a sacrament. They did not understand the frost that followed Hela, but they understood the shift it represented, and they could not tolerate a rival claim to death. Their leader was called Priest Butcher Larkos, a man who had once been a dock enforcer before rage remade him into a mouthpiece for the blood god. He had no pity left inside him, only the gospel of impact, and the red hunger that came when the warp whispered that slaughter was purpose. When reports reached his shrine that a pale queen was taking bodies without spilling proper blood, Larkos felt it as an insult to Khorne's throne. The dead belonged to the blood god by right of violence, not to some silent thief of souls. He gathered his faithful in a pressure chamber that had once housed coolant regulators. Now it was a cathedral of butchered steel. Skulls were welded to support beams. Chains hung heavy with dried sinew. The air pulsed with chanting that was less prayer than drumbeat, a rhythm designed to wake the warp and shake sanity loose. They drank combat stims laced with narcotic fury, painted their skin with fresh arterial red, and armed themselves with chain axes that had teeth like factory saws. Their purpose was not subtle. They would storm the lane of frost and offer the stranger's head to a god who demanded proof through carnage. Hela felt them coming before their boots reached her corridors. Rage has a heat of its own, and to her senses it moved through the hive like a wildfire trapped inside metal lungs. The cult's prayers to Khorne did not frighten her. They were loud, hungry, and simple. She had ruled over a realm where death carried order, where the dead arrived not as offerings to appetite but as subjects under law. These cultists treated death as a feast. That ignorance placed them beneath contempt. Still, there was usefulness in meeting the first true challenge with clarity. They found her in a transit junction where rails split into 4 directions, an old artery of the hive now half flooded and half collapsed. Frost coated the tracks in pale veins. The dead from Cobalt Row stood behind her in a silent wedge, their posture calm, weapons lowered, a guard no living commander could demand so cleanly. Larkos entered with 30 berserkers at his back, roaring litanies that made the lumen strips flicker. He raised his axe in a sweeping salute to war, expecting terror, expecting a reaction that would validate his god. Her gaze did not shift. The cult charged anyway, because rage cannot pause once it decides a direction. The first wave hit her line hard. Chain axes tore into undead flak armor, throwing sparks and frozen gore. The returned rose again, fell again, their loyalty beyond pain. Hela stepped forward through the chaos of bodies, blades blooming from her hands like black flowers in winter. Movements were clean, almost bored, each strike removing an opponent from life as if crossing them off inventory. Larkos met her with a roar that shook rust from the ceiling. His axe came down in a 2-handed execution stroke, wrapped in warp fury and the certainty that Khorne watched. She caught the haft, not with strain, but with the calm economy of a ruler correcting a peasant's overreach. The metal creaked. The cult leader's arms trembled as if the weight of his own hatred had turned against him. Her other hand rose, and a necroblade slid through his chest. His voice died in the same breath it tried to shout. The cult's momentum faltered, not because they lost courage, but because their god's promised triumph had stalled against something colder than anger. She did not need to taunt them. She did not need to explain. Their deaths made her point. One by one they fell, the blood they spilled freezing before it could spread, the warp heat of their frenzy snuffed into stillness. The Underhive had offered her a first test, and she answered in the only language death respects: inevitability. In the quiet after, the last cultist's body twitched, then rose at her silent command. The blood god's faithful had not simply been defeated, they had been taken, reclaimed into a hierarchy they never believed existed. Hela turned toward the next corridor, with winter settling more deeply around her steps, and the hive's darkness carried the news upward, soft and certain, that a new queen had begun cutting her law into Harrows. Khorne's cults do not accept loss in silence. Where another faction might retreat to gather intelligence, the berserkers of the blood god respond to defeat the way fire responds to wind, by spreading. Larko's death did not end the cult's will, it refined it into a sharper blade. His shrine acolytes pulled his skull from the frost and placed it on a chain altar, letting his last rage seed the next assault. Within hours, drums rolled through hidden corridors, calling every blood-sworn fighter to the pits where they proved devotion through killing. The blood pit lay beneath an abandoned Factorum amphitheater, a round chamber lined with rusted spectator tears and stained by 10,000 secret executions. In its center, a circular arena was sunk into the floor, its walls iron-grated to keep screams inside. The cult had used it for years to crown champions, and tonight it served another purpose, a ritual challenge for the Pale Queen who had stolen their dead. Their champions were not simple gangers. They were men and women reshaped by rage and warp exposure, bodies wrapped in chainmail and scar tissue, muscles swollen by combat stims and Khorne's favor. One carried a 2-meter chain axe whose teeth were carved from looted Astartes' blades. Another wore a brass helm fused into his skull, his breath coming out as a hot animal roar. A third had flayed his own arms and replaced skin with barbed hooks, believing pain pleased the god who watched. They entered the pit one by one, chanting blood oaths that rolled like thunder in the dark. Hela arrived without ceremony. The cult's lookouts had expected a spectacle, perhaps an army, perhaps a wrath that matched their own. Instead, she walked down the iron stairs alone, frost blooming under her feet, the air around her cooling until the pit's torches burned smaller and bluer. The returned followed to the edge of the arena, but did not step into the circle. She did not need a guard. She needed only to remind these champions what death feels like under true rule. The crowd in the tiers was a rough choir of fanaticism, their voices rough with bloodlust and fear. They expected the pit to be their god's stage. The first champion charged the moment her boots touched the arena floor, chain axe whining so high it sounded like a scream of metal desperate to bite. He swung with the full weight of ritual, believing he was the axe Khorne had chosen to make this insult bleed properly. A necroblade formed in her hand mid-step. The movement was almost gentle. She slid past the blade's arc, and her own black edge entered at the champion's ribs, carving upward through lungs and spine. The chain axe hit the floor behind her in a shower of sparks. The man toppled, dead before he could understand the gap between fury and sovereignty. The second champion came harder, armored shoulders lowered, brass helm aimed at her throat. He took 3 steps before a storm of black blades erupted from the air around her, each one a shard of her will. They struck in swift succession, pinning his limbs, then opening his chest in a clean split. His body fell in pieces that steamed once, then froze. The third slowed, a flicker of instinct whispering that this was not a duel meant for mortals. He tried to circle, to find an angle, to make the pit itself an ally. Hela let him move, watching with a calm that made his courage rot in real time. When he finally lunged, hooks sweeping for her face, she met him with her bare hand. Fingers closed around his wrist. Strength flowed through her arm like a locked gate, and the champion's bones shattered in her grip. He screamed once. A blade ended it. Silence thinned the arena. The crowd could not reconcile what it saw. These champions had killed squads of guardsmen, had butchered rival cults, had survived warp fevers that ate the weak. Yet they died in seconds, not because she was faster alone, but because she was absolute. Their god demanded blood. She demanded submission from death itself, and death listened more readily to her. With her last opponent fallen, she raised a hand, and the three corpses stood again, heads bowed, weapons lowered, their rage extinguished into loyal stillness. The sight broke the pit's remaining nerve. Some cultists fled into tunnels, others dropped to their knees in hollow worship, not knowing who they worshipped yet, only knowing the shape of power when it stands at the center of an arena. Hela turned away without triumph, the frost following like a robe, and left the pit with a growing army of the dead behind her. The hive's lower lungs trembled softly at what had just been rewritten, handing the story forward toward a response that would not come from gangers, but from the warp itself. There are rules in the galaxy that do not announce themselves until broken. For 10,000 years, the warp had fed without restraint on Vheros. Every death, every scream, every final hateful thought rose into the Immaterium like smoke into a storm, and the ruinous powers drank it as tribute. The blood god took the rage, the prince of excess took the indulgence, the changer of ways took the despair of plans collapsing, and the lord of decay took the slow rot of bodies grinding down under endless war. It was a harvest so constant that the gods treated it like gravity. Hela's claim interrupted that gravity. When she raised the Blood Pit champions, when she pulled their souls into her dominion instead of letting them flare into warp currents, the Immaterium noticed. Not as a human might, with alarm and debate, but as an ecosystem notices a new predator. The flow of souls shifted, and where there should have been a warm tide of rage-feeding corn, there was sudden cold. A section of the warp above Hive Dominus tightened as if ice had formed on its surface. The blood god felt his tribute thinning, and hunger turned into attention. In the upper atmosphere, Vox arrays began failing in patterns that matched no mechanical fault. Astropaths in the garrison choir felt a pressure on their temples like claws testing bone. They tasted copper on the air, heard distant drums in the back of prayers, sensed a red wind gathering on the edge of reality. The warp was not only reacting, it was leaning in. Down below, Hela walked through a corridor of broken cogitators and hanging cabling. The dead behind her moved without sound. The cold around her thickened. She felt the shift before any incense-breathing priest could name it. A hostile will was pressing against her domain, not curious now, but offended. The feeling was familiar in shape, another throne resisting another throne, yet foreign in flavor, more bestial, more immediate. A god of slaughter was sending a question written in violence. The first sign came as the walls began to bleed heat. Frost hissed and cracked. The air flashed red in brief pulses. A warp fissure, small but furious, tore open in the junction ahead. It was not a grand portal in the sky, only a wound in the corridor itself. Reality flayed open like muscle. From it poured a lesser demon of corn, a brass-skinned hound thing with burning eyes and a maw that dripped flame. It had been born for one purpose, to reclaim stolen deaths by making new ones. The creature charged immediately, claws gouging ferrocrete, breath boiling the frost into steam. Hela met it without stepping back. A necroblade formed in her hand, longer than a man, black as a cold star. She drove it through the demon's chest. The impact should have been a victory for Khorne, for the blood god delights even in his servants dying as long as the violence is rich. But this death did not spill upward. The demon's essence tried to recoil into the fissure, and she pulled it inward instead, claiming the annihilated spirit as property, severing its warp tether the way one severs a chain to a slave. The fissure shrank, starved of the soul fuel it expected. More came, this time not hounds, but horned berserker shades with axes of raw warp iron. They rose from the crack in a red tide. She cut them down with a calm brutality, each strike clean and final, each death freezing the corridor's heat. The dead behind her joined the defense, their lasguns firing on impulse under her will, their bodies absorbing blows meant for her. Every demon she killed lost its path back to its god, dissolving into her dominion rather than the warp. That was the insult Khorne could not stomach, his weapons dying without feeding him. The warp howled around them. The corridor groaned as reality tried to reopen, to flood itself with more blood. She did not allow it. A queen of death does not negotiate with hunger. She walked forward through the fading crack, her presence cooling the wound until it sealed like skin under winter. The last demon vanished into ether that did not return to the blood god's ocean, leaving behind silence and frost. Above, astropaths screamed as the Immaterium recoiled, and then surged again, furious and confused. Below, Hela stood amid evaporating red mist, unshaken, reading the meaning of the pushback like a battlefield map. The gods had noticed her. Good. Their attention meant the harvest was worth guarding, and that meant the galaxy's dead were worth ruling. With the dead tightening their formation behind her, she moved onward, and the air carried her cold certainty toward the moment when the Imperium itself would finally decide whether she was a demon to be purged or a power too useful to deny. By the time the warp fissure sealed, the Underhive was no longer a rumor. It was a pattern of disappearances, a trail of frost, and a series of casualty ledgers that no longer balanced. Those ledgers were the Imperium's true language. A hive can lose 1,000 souls in an hour and still function, but when the numbers stop matching the deaths, command begins to listen. On Vharros, listening came through Colonel Roth, a man who had spent 2 decades holding the line against raids that chewed through regiments like meat grinders. He sat in a command bunker carved into the midhive's reinforced ribs, surrounded by Vox traffic and hololithic overlays of shifting front lines. The battle outside was the usual grind, artillery exchanges, trench pushes, counterpunches into rubble. Yet his staff kept sliding new reports onto his table, each stranger than the last. Patrols vanished without contact in the lower levels. Whole trench segments were found empty, equipment left as if men had simply shrugged out of themselves. Medici wards reported bodies arriving hollow, as if their souls had already been processed elsewhere. Tech adepts filed quiet anomalies about cold zones and auspex static that moved with deliberate direction. Roth was not a man inclined to superstition. He had watched demons tear through barricades. He had seen psychers burst into light and madness. He understood the basic categories: Xenos, traitor, warp. This fit none of them cleanly, and that was what unsettled him. The Underhive was supposed to hold its own horrors, gangs and cults, and slow starvation. A problem reached for high command only when it threatened production or civilian control. Now it was threatening both. Signals were sent down to the Arbite's precincts, and the precincts sent back minimal answers. They were stretched thin and did not relish a descent into levels where even their shotguns felt like prayers against the dark. So Roth did what Imperial officers do when their tools are inadequate. He escalated upward. The first Vox call went to Sector Command, coded Amber. Unknown metaphysical disturbance in Hive Dominus lower strata, probable Hirdeck or warp influence, casualties irregular, command requests inquisitorial examination. The second went to the Mechanicus, demanding a sweep of noospheric anomalies and machine spirit unrest. The third went to the Ecclesiarchy, instructing them to intensify doctrinal control among workers to prevent panic worship of local myths. Each call returned with assurances, delays, and ritual caution, because none of those institutions liked admitting they did not understand what was moving inside the hive. Meanwhile, patrols continued to go missing, and the frost trail continued to grow. In the middle tiers, the effect began touching morale. Guardsmen on rotation swore they had seen a line of dead men walking in the distance, silhouettes moving between furnace towers with precision that living bodies rarely achieved. A squad of trench veterans returned from a tunnel sweep shaken. They reported the same smell, cold iron, and a faint sweetness like funeral smoke. One of them said he had heard no combat, only footsteps that did not echo like boots, more like stones dropping into deep water. Their officers reprimanded them for talk that sounded like heresy, yet the reprimands did not erase the unease. Roth watched his hololith shift to display Hive Dominus substructure, and a quiet line formed in his mind. Whatever this is, it is not random. An enemy cult kills messily. A demon incursion leaves warp residue. A Xenos raid takes prisoners or technology. This left absence. It left order. That thought sat heavy behind his eyes as another report arrived, this one from a tech priest monitoring reactor temperature in the deep levels. He had traced the cold zones to corridors that should not exist, ancient layers sealed before the Hive's current blueprints began. Something was moving upward from a place the Imperium had long forgotten to map. Roth did not pretend to understand gods. His responsibility was keeping V-Heroes alive long enough to keep feeding the wider war. If there was a threat inside the Hive, he needed a blade meant for such threats. The Vox call to the Inquisition was repeated, louder this time, higher priority, and backed by data he could barely interpret. As he waited for the response, he stared at the icy gaps in his casualty charts and felt the Hive's rhythm stutter, as if a new authority was tuning itself to the planet's heartbeat. The handoff was inevitable now. The Imperium had opened its eyes, and those eyes were about to look down into winter. The Inquisition does not arrive like a rescue, it arrives like a sentence. When the dropship engines cut through V-Hero's ash clouds, the sound rolled across the Hive with the weight of law that had no equal. The landing site was a mid-Hive bastion platform near the governor's spire, chosen for safety, surveillance, and the quiet humiliation it imposed on local command. Stormtroopers fanned out first, weapons hot, armor black with the gold seal of holy terror. Behind them came robed acolytes carrying reliquaries, null rods, and incense sensors meant to confuse warp entities. At their center walked Inquisitor Selene Val. Val's presence was a kind of cold, even without Hela's frost. She had the stillness of someone who had watched worlds burn and learned to keep her breathing smooth. Power armor hugged her frame, etched with wards in high Gothic and Binheric. One augment eye glowed faintly with data overlays, and her mind moved with a sharpened focus trained to categorize the unclassifiable. Her duty was simple in philosophy and endless in execution. Find the heretic, name the threat, either bind it to the Emperor's use or erase it so completely that memory becomes ash. Colonel Roth met her at the platform's edge. Formalities were exchanged in clipped ritual phrases that tasted of exhaustion and necessity. Reports were transferred. Data slates clicked. The Inquisitor listened without blinking, watching not only the words but the micro-tremors of fear behind them. Roth was hardened, yet his discomfort was honest, and honesty in command reports mattered more than eloquence. When he finished, Val's gaze drifted to the hololith showing the underhive anomalies, to the dead zones where souls were going missing. She did not speak of demons yet. She did not mention Xenos. Her mind ran through classifications that had governed her life: rogue psyker, chaos magus, necromantic cult, minor warp anomaly escalating toward a breach. Each possibility fit halfway then failed. The absence of bodies suggested theft. The frost suggested a metaphysical climate rather than a weapon. The raised dead reported in whispers suggested sorcery, but without the usual warp stench. That contradiction tightened her focus like a blade taking an edge. The descent began within the hour. She took a tight retinue, stormtroopers on point, 2 sanctioned psychers sealed behind hexagrammic wards, a tech adept for Auspex interpretation, and a priest whose hymns could steady the troops if the darkness began whispering back. They moved down through elevator shafts and service corridors toward levels the Hive no longer labeled by number, only by superstition. Hela felt the approach long before they crossed into her wake. The Inquisitor's mind carried its own gravity, a disciplined authority that did not tremble before the unknown. It was not rage like the cultists she had crushed, nor hunger like the warp fissure she had sealed. This was a weapon of order, sharp, suspicious, and sincere. Her dead tightened their formation at her back without command. frost thickened along the corridor floor. She continued walking, because the meeting was already decided by motion, not by negotiation. The inquisitorial column entered a transit hall where frost glazed the ceiling like pale marble. Lumen strips buzzed low. Bodies stood along the walls in neat ranks, dead soldiers, gangers, cultists, their heads bowed. Stormtroopers raised hellguns instantly, targeting reticules locking on the corpses. The sanctioned psychers murmured warding litanies with careful breath, their eyes already watering from the cold pressure that carried no warp signature they could name. Then Hela stepped into view. The hall seemed to narrow around her silhouette. Green-black armor caught the dim light. Hair flowed still, untouched by the draft of the cavern. Her expression was not hostile, it was sovereign. Vol felt the wards on her armor prickle, not as if burned, but as if brushed aside by something too old to register. No corruption markers flared, no warp flare spiked. Yet the air itself bowed, and the dead behind the goddess moved like a shadow with rank. Vol's voice came steady and low, the shape of command sharpened into law, submit to examination in the name of the God Emperor. The words were not shouted, they were delivered as inevitability, because that is how the Inquisition survives. Hela did not answer with anger. Silence was her reply. A queen does not explain herself at the edge of her own domain. The space between them filled with a tense calm, a moment where two orders measured each other without flinching. The Inquisitor's retinue waited for her signal. The dead waited for Hela's will. Vol could feel it clearly now. Whatever this being was, it did not fit the warp's appetite, and it did not fit the Imperium's obedience. That made it the most dangerous kind of anomaly. Her hand hovered near her consecrated sidearm, not in fear, but in readiness. Hela's gaze held her, and the air chilled another degree, offering a soft handoff into the coming clash of wills that would decide whether Viharios had found a savior, a tyrant, or something the Imperium had never learned to name. The hall held its breath. Frost clung to the pillars and grated floors, and the dead stood in patient lines that did not twitch, did not sway, as if the hive itself had been rearranged into a mausoleum with a living witness at its center. Hela felt each of those bodies like extensions of her domain, not puppets, but subjects whose state belonged to her authority. Their stillness was not menace for show, it was order made visible. The Imperium had never seen death look so disciplined. Inquisitor Selene Vol did not step back. Stormtroopers kept weapons trained, the sanctioned psychers tightened their wards, and the priest's mouth moved in quiet litanies that were more reflex than faith. Vol's mind was sharp and layered, scanning for corruption, mutation, warp resonance. It found none. That absence pressed into her instincts like a riddle that refused to resolve. The Inquisition survived by naming threats. Unnamed threats were where empires bled out. Submit, Vol repeated, voice calm with the certainty of law. The words came steady and low, carried by a lifetime of watching monsters fold under imperial authority. She expected resistance, perhaps screaming sorcery, perhaps the oily evasions of a demon. Instead, she met a gaze that did not argue with a lesser throne. Hela held the silence the way cold holds a lake, unbroken and complete. The question was not whether she would comply, but whether the Imperium understood the scale of what it was asking. The stormtroopers advanced half a step at their Inquisitor's micro-gesture. Auspex arrays swept the hall, trying to draw her into their nets of measurement. They tracked temperature gradients, heartbeat signatures, psychic flux. The readings returned a blank that felt like polished stone, and their targeting systems hesitated as if unsure where the center of the room truly was. The psychers reached out in cautious probes, minds trained to tug at the warp for truth, and felt their touch slide away from her presence. Not blocked, not burned, simply irrelevant. Their brows beaded with sweat that froze on contact with the air. A trooper's finger tightened. Hellgun beams lanced out in a clean volley meant to drop power-armored witches. The shots crossed the space between them and died in midair, their light folding inward as if swallowed by a gravity that did not need to announce itself. Hela had not moved. The air around her had decided the beams had no permission to arrive. Frost glittered where the energy had vanished, a faint afterimage of refusal. Vol's wards flared, then dimmed, not shattered, but pushed aside like curtains in a wind. The realization sharpened behind her augment eye. This was not a rogue psyker drawing from the warp, not a chaos sorceress wearing stolen power. This was a ruling principle of death standing in real space, a sovereignty that did not share its sources. Hela lifted a hand. Her necroblades did not roar into being, they unfolded like night flowers in slow winter. A line of black edges formed around her shoulders and wrists, each one poised without haste. The dead behind her raised their weapons not to fire, but to create a wall of obedient flesh. The gesture was not a threat, it was correction. The hall understood it first, tightening in cold respect. Vol took a breath that fogged. Termination was her right, and perhaps her duty, yet the moment carried its own warning. The Inquisitor could feel that if she fired again, she would not be fighting a target, but a law of reality that treated her rituals as provincial. There was no fear in the thought, only calculation. She had seen warlords die because pride demanded purity more than survival. Vol had no intention of joining them. The Inquisitor's voice softened into a different shape, still firm, but angled toward understanding rather than conquest. State your nature and intent. Hela let the silence linger a beat longer, then answered without raising her tone. The words came calm certainty made sound. A queen does not submit, she judges. The sentence hung in the frozen air like a blade laid on a table. Vol's retinue felt it ripple through them, that the confrontation had crossed from interrogation into a contest of authority. The Imperium's holy terror stood face to face with death's ancient crown, and neither could pretend the other was small. In that stillness, a distant alarm began to rise through the Hive's Vox network, its urgency building, offering a soft handoff toward a new crisis that would force law and winter into the same trench. The alarm that rolled through the Vox channel did not come from the Underhive. It came from orbit, from Auspex arrays watching the blood-red sky for threats that never stopped circling a Forge World's throat. Colonel Roth's voice cut in, strained under static and urgency, enemy warp signatures breaching the outer system, multiple vessels, traitor legion markings confirmed. The words did not need elaboration. V-Harrows had lived under siege long enough to recognize the taste of that sentence. A chaos fleet meant bombardment, drop pods, and a ground war fought by veterans who had forgotten how to lose. Hela felt the shift in the Immaterium like a tide turning colder, not in temperature but in intent. Thousands of corrupted minds were drawing nearer, their presence a jagged heat against her senses. Korn's attention sharpened again, no longer probing, now eager. The Blood God's forces would come for the planet, and for the anomaly stealing his harvest. The city above would drown in violence regardless of her decision. The question was who would be ruling its dead when the drowning began. Vol turned slightly, listening to the transmission, then looked back at Hela with a kind of grim clarity. The Inquisitor's protocols screamed for containment, for immediate arrest, for purging before an unclassified power could destabilize the Hive. Yet those same protocols also demanded protection of the Imperium at any cost, and a chaos fleet dropping into the Hive's heart was a cost measured in millions. Vol's mind weighed the two demands and felt the scales tilt toward necessity. Stormtroopers held their line, unsure whether to aim at the pale sovereign or the coming storm. The Psychers were pale from effort, their wards still searching for a hook that would not come. The priests' litanies turned to battlefield rites, words meant to keep courage from fracturing. Hela watched them with the calm of a ruler who has never seen survival as a plea. Their fear was not contemptible. It was a currency she understood well. Mortals bargain with fear because they cannot bargain with time. Vol spoke slowly, each syllable chosen like a shot. This planet is about to fall into a war we may not hold. Your presence is a threat by any chart I carry, yet your hand has already broken Korn's cults and sealed a warp wound. If you wish to walk this city unopposed, prove that your power serves its defense. The words came steady and low, not a surrender, but an offer shaped by realism. She was acknowledging a blade she could not sheath, hoping to aim it instead. Hela felt the truth beneath the offer. The Imperium did not trust her. It could not. Its entire structure was built on obedience to a distant throne that allowed no rival authority. Still, in this moment, survival pushed dogma aside. That was not weakness. It was the first sign of sense in a galaxy that had treated death like waste. A bargain founded on necessity was purer than one founded on worship. She stepped forward, frost whispering against Ferrocrete. The dead behind her moved with her like a shadow that understood formation. Her voice was quiet, but it carried far in the hall's winter. The dead of this world will not feed your enemies. They will not feed mine. The sentence was both promise and claim. She did not say she fought for the Emperor. She did not say she fought against chaos for love of mankind. She said the dead were hers, and therefore the war would obey her interests. Val's augment eye flickered, judging the implications. There was no humility in Hela's words, only sovereignty. Yet in that sovereignty lay a weapon that chaos could not predict. Val nodded once, the motion small but decisive. Then we fight beside you until this threat is broken. The retinue shifted subtly, weapons lowering a few degrees, breath easing in chests that had been tight for too long. A deal had been struck without reverence, without trust, only with the cold practicality of those who live long enough to see rules bend. Hela turned toward the upward corridors. The underhive's cold began climbing with her steps. Above, the sky was already preparing to bleed fire. The hive's next hour would be written in drop pods and screaming brass, and she would be there to decide what the dead became afterward. The bargain settled into the air like a new law, handing the narration forward toward the first sparks of invasion that would test whether winter could command a battlefield built for rage. The first impact came as a tremor through the hive's spine. Void shields flickered overhead, their generators strained by orbital fire, and for a brief moment the ash sky brightened with the orange bloom of bombardment. Hab blocks folded in on themselves on the far side of the city, turning into cascading rubble that swallowed streets and prayer shrines alike. V-Harrows had learned to read those flashes the way sailors read storms. The fleet was softening the hive, preparing a landing that would aim at its heart. Drop pods fell next, not from a theatrical tier in the heavens, but like iron nails driven into flesh. They screamed through the atmosphere in tight formation, their heat trails cutting red lines across clouds already stained by warp light. Some were shot down by defense batteries and shattered into flaming fragments. Most were not. They struck the governmental district and the Cathedral Forge quarter, their retro thrusters burning craters into plazas where Imperial banners still hung. Ceramite doors blew open in bursts of smoke, and Chaos Space Marines stepped out into real space like old nightmares remembering their shape. These were veterans of the Long War. Their armor was thick with scars and brazen runes. Each plate carried the dull sheen of warp corruption, as if reality itself had grown tired of resisting their presence. Bolters roared, mass-reactive rounds tearing through Hab walls and turning defenders into red mist. Cultists followed in the spaces between them, screaming names of dark gods, more numerous than disciplined, a flood of bodies meant to drown the defenders in pure arithmetic. From within her moving winter, Hela felt the invasion as a rush of heat and hunger pressing toward her domain. The traitors carried the warp stink, an oily appetite that tried to curl around the dead like hands reaching for stolen food. Korn's laughter crackled through the Immaterium at each burst of violence, eager for a harvest that had fueled him for millennia. The blood god expected the planet's souls to rise to him in a warm tide. He did not yet understand that a colder throne had already begun taking inventory. Imperial defense lines buckled quickly under the first wave. Guardsmen fought hard in trenches and choke points, their discipline held together by fear of commissars and a faith that promised meaning to dying. Heavy weapon teams set up firing lanes between Manufactorum towers, pouring laws and autocannon fire into the oncoming ceramite wall. It slowed the advance, but did not stop it. Chaos Marines moved like machines built for siege, advancing through explosions that would pulp normal bodies, their return fire carving defenders into pieces. Inquisitor Val coordinated from a mid-hive bastion, directing stormtroopers into layered kill zones and ordering the Psyker Choir to reinforce weakening shield nodes. Her voice steadied the net, but she could feel the numbers. The enemy had experience and momentum. Even if the defense held this hour, the next would cost too much in blood. Hela moved through the middle tiers toward the Cathedral Forge quarter where the heaviest landing struck. The dead followed in growing rank. Every intersection went cold as she passed. Citizens pressed against walls, staring in numb disbelief at the silent procession of corpses. Some crossed themselves with shaking hands. Some simply watched, too shocked for prayer. In their eyes, she read survival's simplest hope, that someone able to rule death might also rule the war. They reached a boulevard where artillery had chewed the street into broken teeth. Chaos cultists poured across it in a ragged tide, and behind them lumbered a demon engine, a brass andiron beast with a cannon maw, belching shells into hab rows. It was a creature half-machine, half-warp appetite, built to turn cities into altars of rubble. The defenders were falling back in disarray. Hela raised a hand, and the air around her thickened. Necroblades formed, not as decoration but as a storm of black geometry. She walked forward into the tide without haste. Cultists crashed against the dead wall behind her, their chain blades biting into corpses that did not flinch. Her blades struck with elegant cruelty, dropping bodies into the street faster than the cult could comprehend. The demon engine fired, its shells detonating in heaps of fire, and the explosion washed over her like hot wind against stone. She did not stagger. A queen of hell had stood before dragons and gods, and this engine was only another beast that assumed death belonged elsewhere. As the last cultists fell, their souls did not rise. They sank into her cold gravity, claimed before the warp could take them. The boulevard began filling with bodies that did not stay bodies for long. Around her, the battlefield's meaning shifted. Chaos had made planetfall, and it expected a feast. Instead, it had landed inside a kingdom where death already had a ruler. The war was now moving to her rhythm, and the next hours would show whether that rhythm could break a legion. The handoff softened into the rising tide of battle she was about to command. Chaos fought to multiply death. Hela fought to own it. The difference seemed small only to those who had never watched a battlefield change its allegiance mid-breath. Where traitors saw corpses as fuel for terror and devotion, she saw them as a growing architecture of power, a domain expanding with every fallen heart. On Viharos, that meant the fight would never be measured only in ground held or guns silenced. It would be measured in who claimed the ending. She advanced through streets that had been Manufactorum access lanes before war turned them into trenches of rubble. Each step carried winter forward. Every corpse she passed stirred faintly, not immediately rising, but turning toward her like iron filings turning to a magnet. The dead were not commanded by shouted orders. Their obedience was quiet, a natural return to hierarchy they had been denied in life. Imperial squads had begun to notice. Some fought alongside the dead without understanding why. Others recoiled, thinking the walking corpses were a deception, a chaos trick, until they watched those same corpses interpose themselves between guardsmen and bolter fire. Flak-armored bodies took rounds that would have split living men, fell, then rose again, their loyalty beyond exhaustion. The sight froze fear into awe. It did not feel like warp puppetry. It felt like a law reasserting itself. Inquisitor Vol kept her forces disciplined. She ordered stormtroopers to treat the returned as allied assets, despite the teeth-grinding heresy it implied. Pragmatism held the line because Vol could see the effect. Every time the traitors pushed a street, they met not only living defenders but a second tide of silent bodies pressing back, swelling by the minute. She did not trust Hela. She trusted outcomes. Chaos commanders felt the shift more slowly. Their vox nets filled with confused reports, bodies rising behind Imperial lines, cultists killed, and then standing again under a cold banner that no god recognized. The traitors responded with more aggression, more bombardment, more chainblade charges intended to overwhelm by volume. That volume only fattened Hela's domain. Each kill turned into another soldier for her ranks, and each fallen traitor became a warning to those who still believed death was a one-way tribute to the warp. At an intersection beneath a collapsed bridge, a squad of iron warriors attempted to establish a heavy weapon nest. Their armor was thicker, their discipline colder, and their eyes lacked the frothing hunger of cultists. They deployed autocannons and missile racks with practiced speed, carving a firing lane down the street. Imperial defenders, pinned behind an overturned transport, began to break under the weight of incoming shells. Hela stepped into their line of sight. The autocannon roared. Rounds ripped through the air, and she met them with a drifting lift of her arm. Necroblades flashed, cutting impacts apart before they reached her. Shards of metal fell in frozen arcs. She walked onward through the storm, and the iron warriors felt something they were not trained for. Not fear of dying. They had died in spirit 10 millennia ago. It was fear of being claimed by a power their gods could not interpret. She closed the distance with effortless speed, superhuman strength turning rubble into stepping stones. A blade formed across her forearm like a guillotine of night. One warrior fell in a clean diagonal cut. Another raised a chainsword and met a storm of black edges that tore his arms away before the scream could finish. The third tried to retreat, Vox sputtering for support, and the dead behind her surged forward, grabbing him with hands that did not tire, pulling him into her shadow. He died there and rose again with his bolter lowered at her feet. The street quieted under her control. Imperial squads pushed forward behind her winter, reclaiming ground that minutes ago felt lost. Citizens watching from shattered windows saw the dead marching beside their living sons, and something inside them shifted. This was not the Emperor's distant mercy. This was immediate, terrible protection. Faith began to fracture into a new shape, not worship yet, but recognition of a sovereign moving through their disaster as if it were already her realm. Hela felt the battlefield align. She did not shout commands. The dead did not need them. Her will flowed through the geography of death itself, tightening around key streets, thickening in rear alleys, leaning against chaos flanks like a closing frost front. She was not improvising power. She was using what she had always had, dominion over the dead, now applied to a galaxy that had created more corpses than any realm she had known. Through the warp she sensed Khorne's growing fury, a red storm pressing to break her claim. It only confirmed her advantage. A god who depends on tribute becomes blind when tribute stops. She would keep it stopped. The war was moving toward a point where the enemy's spine could be snapped, and she already knew where their command would try to anchor. With that surety settling like iron in her chest, she turned toward the governmental district, her dead forming behind her in clean ranks, handing the narration softly forward into the surgical strike she was about to deliver. Chaos holds ground through terror, but it holds wars through command. Hela understood hierarchy too well to waste time bleeding an army from the edges. The Iron Warriors were not cultists to be scattered by fear. They were siege veterans who would keep advancing until their head was severed. She could feel their command node in the governmental district like a hot knot of will, a cluster of disciplined minds organizing fire lanes and reinforcement routes with mechanical precision. That knot needed to go cold. She moved through service tunnels that ran beneath the streets, guided by the dead's memory and her own sense of gravity in the warp. Around her, the returned flowed in silence, a shadow company that made no vox noise and left no heat signature for auspex arrays to bite. Above, bolter fire and explosions continued to rage, but down here the battlefield narrowed to a corridor, a single artery leading toward the enemy's heart. At a junction, she paused, listening. The Iron Warriors had sealed their rear approaches with kill zones and motion sensors. Servo turrets waited in alcoves, their barrels tracking any heat spike. Mines were planted in patterns that would shred a conventional infiltrator. Hela did not treat those defenses as obstacles. She treated them like the failed wards in her vault, rules belonging to someone else that could not fully account for Death's queen. Frost rolled outward from her steps. Sensors iced over, their machine spirits stuttering under a temperature they could not model. Mines went still as their trigger filaments froze. Turrets clicked once, then sagged, power routing into failures too subtle for a tech marine to diagnose in time. The path opened without a sound. The first sentry stood outside the command bunker's service hatch, armor heavy, bolter held low in professional boredom. Hela reached him before the thought of surprise could form. A necro blade slid in cleanly beneath his gorget. He fell without a cry, and his soul did not flee to the warp. It settled into her pull. The body rose again at a flick of her will, turning to stand guard for her instead. Inside, the bunker was a reinforced maze, once the planetary governor's emergency shelter. Now it was Chaos headquarters, wall screens painted with tactical overlays, Vox officers relaying firing patterns, heavy weapon stocks piled against the concrete ribs. Iron warriors moved through it with the calm of those who do not believe in defeat. Their warsmith, Drakkar, was at its center, a towering figure fused into his armor by centuries of corruption and siege work. One arm was a heavy autocannon grafted into flesh. The other carried a maul built to crack tanks. His mind burned with cold contempt for the Imperium, and now with rising irritation at the reports that made no sense. Units disappearing without contact, rear sensors failing, dead rising under an unknown banner. Drakkar tried to draw a warp classification and found only static. The ignorance angered him more than loss. Then the blast door behind the bunker's main chamber buckled inward gently, as if kneeling to something approaching. Hela entered without hurry. The room's light dimmed. Frost crawled up reinforced pillars. Half a dozen iron warriors snapped weapons toward her, but their targeting reticules skittered, unwilling to settle. The first volley erupted anyway. Bolter rounds detonated in the air around her, their explosions folding into cold vapor. She walked through the smoke untouched, blades forming along her arms and shoulders like a crown of night. The Marines charged. She met them with a storm that was all elegance and execution. One fell to a horizontal cut that split ceramite like wet parchment. Another lost his head before his chainsword could complete its arc. The third tried to raise a power fist, and the dead at her back pinned him, holding him upright while her blade entered his chest. Each corpse joined her ranks the moment it hit the floor. Drakkar roared and lunged, maul swinging in a crushing circle meant to pulp a god. She caught the strike on a black blade that had grown longer than the maul itself, the impact ringing through the chamber like a bell in a winter cathedral. His strength was monstrous, enhanced beyond human limits, yet her arm did not give. She pushed back not with strain, but with the quiet superiority of a ruler correcting a brute's tantrum. A second blade formed, slipped under his breastplate, and rose through his heart. The warsmith froze, eyes widening as his soul was pulled away from the warp's hungry current and into her dominion. He fell to his knees, then to the floor, dead without being offered to any god he served. Around him, the bunker's Vox screens flickered, command algorithms stuttering as their anchor vanished. Outside, iron warriors on the street felt the sudden slack in their net, orders cut off, fire lanes overlapped wrong, confidence fractured, the spine had been severed. Hela stood amid the bunker's cooling air, dead Marines rising around her in obedient silence. The governmental district above was already shifting as the traitor line began to fold, and she felt the battlefield turning in her favor like a tide obeying the moon. She did not savor the moment. Decapitation was a tool, not a feast. With winter settling deeper in the corridors, she turned back toward the surface where the living still fought, offering a soft handoff into the enemy's coming retreat and the larger duel that still waited in the hive's sacred core. The retreat began at the edges first, chaos squads falling back by instinct when their Vox net went hollow. Yet the war did not belong to instinct alone. It belonged to whatever champion still believed rage could restore order to a broken assault. Hela felt that champion before anyone reported his presence. A heat like a furnace with a heartbeat moved through the hive toward the cathedral forge, pulling surviving berserkers into its wake the way fire pulls oxygen. Khorne's will was concentrating into one blade, meant to make a statement. The cathedral forge rose in the upper middle tiers, a place where faith and industry fused into a single monument. Its nave was wide enough to fit titans, its ceiling held up by black iron ribs shaped into saints and engine symbols, its altars flanked by assembly lines that never paused even during bombardment. The emperor's icon stood at the far end, gold dulled by ash, watched over by servo skulls that drifted like pale moths through incense haze. Now the building shook under distant shelling, stained glass rattling in frames, and the air was thick with prayer and smoke. Hela entered through shattered gates, winter sweeping behind her in a long breath. The dead formed a quiet ring along the aisles, standing between pillars like an honor guard that had no need for banners. Citizens and guardsmen had already withdrawn, leaving only the echo of hymns and the metallic groan of forged machinery. She walked to the center of the nave and waited, because a queen does not chase a challenger into her own seat. The Chaos Champion arrived with the sound of chain blades and roaring devotion. He was an exalted berserker lord, tall in brass-edged armor helm crowned with horns that had grown into the ceramite itself. His axe was a slab of warp iron the size of a door, glowing with heat that made nearby air shimmer. Behind him, a handful of surviving berserkers skidded to a halt, forming a red shadow that fed on his certainty. His mind was a furnace of belief, the pure idea that blood paid every debt. He charged without pause, footsteps shaking dust from high arches. The axe came down in a killing arc meant to split a goddess into tribute. Hela met it with a blade that formed from her forearm like a night spear. Impact rang through the nave, sparks and frost scattering together. She slid to the side, strength steady, and a second blade bloomed into her free hand, striking at the seam beneath his pauldron. The berserker lord twisted, armor shrieking as the edge bit through. He answered with a backhand swing that clipped her shoulder, a hit that would have turned a mortal to ash. Her body absorbed it with the resilience of divinity, and she stepped in closer rather than away. They fought between pillars and forge altars, heat and winter tearing at the same air. His rage was endless, driven by a god's hunger. Her calm was deeper, driven by ownership. Each time the axe struck, she redirected, letting the weapon's weight carry past her, then answered with precise cuts that opened joints and cracked brass. He roared louder, believing volume could replace advantage. She did not answer with sound. A storm of necroblades gathered around her like a halo of black rain. When the opening came, it was inevitable. She caught the axe haft in one hand, halted it as if it were a door being closed, and lifted the other. The storm fell. Blades pierced his armor from every angle, pinning him in place, driving through heart and spine and the warp-frenzied engine of his devotion. He staggered, tried to speak his god's name, and found no breath left to carry it. Hela stepped near, palm resting against his chest plate with calm certainty, and claimed what he was before the warp could take it. The berserker lord fell to his knees, then forward onto the cathedral floor, dead in a silence that tasted like snow. The red shadow behind him hesitated, then broke, retreating into the nave's broken side doors. The cathedral forge settled into a cold hush, its sacred machines still humming, its banners still swaying in the draft of war. Hela stood at the center with her dead in quiet ranks, and the city outside began to feel the battle tip toward conclusion, handing the moment softly into the stunned aftermath that would follow. The battle unraveled quickly once the champion fell. Chaos forces still on the streets felt the loss like a severed tendon. Their charge lost direction, their retreat gained urgency, and within the hour the surviving traders were pulling back toward extraction zones the fleet could barely hold. Imperial artillery followed them with exhausted efficiency. Guardsmen advanced through smoke and rubble where minutes ago they had expected to die, reclaiming alleys that now felt strangely quiet. The sky was still lit by fires, but the warp's pressure eased, like a fist unclenching after realizing the throat had slipped away. Hela moved through the aftermath without triumph. Her winter lingered, but it was no longer the spearhead of battle. It was the mantle of rule settling over a conquered field. The dead stood everywhere now, lining broken boulevards, gathered near collapsed hab rows, stationed beside gun emplacements that had once been imperial and now felt like part of her domain. They did not moan, did not wander, did not decay. They waited, silent proof that this war's endings had been collected and reorganized. Imperial soldiers stared at them when they passed. Some could not meet the empty visors. Others saluted without thinking, not to the corpses, but to the authority that had made them disciplined. Commissars tried to bark order into the confusion and found their own voices softer than usual. Faith had always framed the dead as belonging to the Emperor's distant light, but these dead belonged visibly to someone walking among them now. That contradiction cracked something in the hive's collective prayer. Inquisitor Vol approached her with ash on her armor and a mind heavy with calculus. The planet was saved in the most practical sense, factories still standing, command nodes intact, the fleet withdrawing. Yet salvation had come from a power no imperial book could classify, a sovereign who had not once invoked the Emperor's name. Vol's retinue kept a careful distance, weapons lowered but ready, eyes tracking the dead as if any one of them might become a verdict. Hela felt the Inquisitor's approach like a blade held steady at her back and did not turn away from it. Vol spoke in low formality, reporting the retreat, confirming orbital space was stabilizing, acknowledging what had been done without praising it. Her training demanded caution. Her survival instincts demanded respect. Both were present in the same breath. Civilians began to gather at broken intersections, hesitant at first, then in swelling clusters. They looked at Hela the way starving people look at bread and fire, with fear, hope, and confusion tangled together. Some knelt, palms trembling in old reflex. Others whispered prayers to the Emperor and found the words faltering, not from rebellion, but from the shock of seeing another kind of certainty walking in real space. The hive's priests watched from stairwells with pale faces, sensing a crisis of meaning they had no sermon ready to contain. Hela did not address the crowds. A queen does not soothe. She rules. Still, she could feel their awe settling into the city like a new layer of frost, and she understood its usefulness. Faith in the Imperium was brittle because it was distant. Fear of her was immediate because she was here. Between those truths, a new order could be shaped. The dead remained still at her silent command. The living remained stunned at what they had witnessed. Vol's mind raced ahead to Sector Command, and the words she would have to choose carefully. The Imperium had survived the day, but it had also met a power that pulled its foundations into question. That realization moved through Hive Dominus like a quiet aftershock, handing the story onward into a cosmic reckoning far larger than one planet's victory. Night on Vharros came without darkness, only a deeper red in the ash sky and the slow cooling of fires. The forge sun dipped behind smoke, and the hive's lights took over, a million pale lumens flickering like tired stars. Hela stood on a high transept balcony of the cathedral forge, looking out across the city's wound. Below, the dead held their lines in silence while the living repaired barricades, gathered wounded, and tried to fold victory into comprehension. The air around her remained cold, but it was no longer defensive winter. It was the climate of ownership settling into place. She listened to the planet's heartbeat. It was quieter now, but still heavy with loss. The galaxy beyond pulsed in her senses like an endless battlefield, worlds rising and falling in a tide of funerals that no single throne had ever truly governed. Every death in this realm had been treated as fuel for others, fed to the warp's appetites or to the Emperor's failing light. Her presence had proven a different rule. Death can be claimed without worship and can be organized without hunger. In the Immaterium, that proof landed like a stone in still water. The warp shifted in response. Korn's red storm roiled with fury at tribute denied. Tzeentch's currents twisted in interest, trying to map a power that did not follow his schemes. Nurgle's vast patience turned a fraction of attention toward this cold authority that resisted decay's slow ownership. Slaanesh tasted the fear turning to awe within Vharros' populace and wondered what it might become under a queen who did not bargain for devotion. None of them understood her source. all of them understood the consequence. Farther still, beyond the warp's hunger, the astronomican's distant glow flickered against new shadow. The Emperor's light was old, sustained by sacrifice, and in that old light a new silhouette had appeared, not as a demon to be banished, but as a rival order standing beside his throne's domain. Somewhere in the labyrinthine corridors of Terra's power, minds would soon turn toward V'Haros, not as a footnote of battle, but as a rupture in the galaxy's assumptions. Hela felt those turning minds as faint pressure, inquisitors, lords militant, priests, perhaps even entities older than them all. She did not fear their scrutiny. She had walked through betrayal, conquest, and exile, and still remained inevitable. This galaxy did not need another god that fed on it. It needed a ruler of the dead who would not waste them. The thought moved through her with calm certainty, steady and low. Hell was once a realm at the edge of a universe. Here, death was the universe's center. A kingdom this vast could not remain ungoverned, not while war made corpses faster than hope could bury them. She would not offer herself as a servant to any throne, neither golden nor crimson. She would take the realm that already belonged to her by nature. Below, the dead remained waiting, the living remained shaken, and the stars above seemed a little closer, as if listening. In the depths of the warp, ancient powers shifted their weight, preparing responses they could not yet define. A new player had stepped into the great game, one who did not play by the rules of appetite or faith, but by the law of death itself. V'Haros was only the first proof. The galaxy would be the next. If you hunger for more tales of impossible encounters in the dark millennium, smash that subscribe button, and the Emperor protects those who support the channel.